You know, I like my stuff. Well, by stuff, I mean my personal possessions. I have a lot of stuff, which I've managed to accumulate and collect, you know, over 30 years plus years of ministry. Some of that stuff has material value, like I have this coin collection that I've been working on for about 20 years now. Sometimes you just sit and look at it, count it, touch it. And I have some artwork as well. I like art, and when I visit different countries, you know, on trips, I'll usually buy a piece of art, not of great value, but something that reminds me of the places that I've been. It's my stuff. I have stuff that has a more personal meaning to me, sometimes gifts from family and friends. It could be like knickknacks and books and things that people give me Christmas or my birthday. Some stuff that I have belonged to my parents at one time. So those have like some nostalgic value for me. But I have to tell you, a lot of that stuff sits in plastic bins that are in my closet or maybe in my garage. I rarely look at a lot of that stuff that's stored away. But I know they're there, and they're my stuff, and I like owning them. Each of us has this kind of stuff, don't we? In some ways, our stuff helps define us, maybe to other people. They remind us of people we love and places we've been. Perhaps we have stuff that brings back fond memories of our childhood and the hard work maybe that we put into purchasing and accumulating some things. We've gathered all these things around us, and now we have them, and we don't like letting them go necessarily. For instance, I sometimes think about this stuff that I have stored away that I really don't look at too much, and I don't really need them, obviously. And sometimes the thought occurs to me, maybe I should just give them to my nieces and nephews. But it's hard. It's hard to part company with some of these things. Plus, I'm not even certain that they would value the stuff like I value it. So I end up hanging on to these things. Year after year goes by, and the stuff is still there. Now, the problem that I recognize, of course, is that sometimes the stuff we have can become burdensome. For instance, if you have had to move from one house to another, you realize just how tedious it is to pack all of your possessions. And you probably wish that you didn't have all those things, because you would have had fewer boxes and less furniture, less expense to move. And when money is tight or space becomes limited, you may begin to consider downsizing, which means that you will have to get rid of some stuff or else pay to put them in storage. Now, Jesus knew that this can be complicated. Possessions are a complicated thing, and he knew that possessions can create a problem if people don't have the proper relationship to these material things. Sometimes our possessions begin to take possession of us, and they can prevent us from focusing on the more important things in life. That's why Jesus in one gospel says it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. You know, in biblical times, a person was considered rich on the basis of their possessions, the things that they could pack up. Imagine a person piling all of his possessions onto a camel and then trying to pass that camel through the narrow entrance of a city gate, which is what the needle was. The eye of the needle was the small entrance that you had to pass through to enter the city. It was narrow. Most people had to unload their possessions before entering with their camel, or else you put your camel on a diet so it can get through that fence. No wonder Jesus says it's easier for a loaded down camel to get into this narrow city gate than it would for someone who clings to their things, the rich, those who are greedy perhaps. It's hard for them to divest themselves so they can get into the narrow path to heaven. But you know, Jesus is not simply concerned about having material things, because material things in and of themselves are not moral or immoral. His concern is with the kind of greed which we demand, by which we demand to accumulate more and more things. Greed has always been considered one of the deadly sins, right? The Bible spends a lot of verses talking about greed. Some people call greed the wanting disease. The wanting disease. We want certain things, but we can't ever seem to get enough. We want more and more. Greed is a longing or a desiring of certain things by which we can never be satisfied. So people who suffer from greed can never find contentment with what they already have. They're always looking for more. And at times, greed causes people to do terrible things, to cheat, to steal, and even to kill. And the second reading tells us that greed is a form of idolatry, when the possession becomes all in all, an end in itself. Now, today we hear the story of Jesus. He's teaching the crowds when somebody says to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to give me my share of the inheritance," okay? What does he think? This is Judge Judy or something like that, okay? Obviously, this guy and his brother inherited some money, probably from the father. Maybe it was land or something. And the brother wasn't sharing giving him half of the inheritance to his other brother. So, this guy's concerned. He's mad. But Jesus is not about to get into the business of mediating a squabble about someone's inheritance. Rather, what does he do? He takes the opportunity to teach about the dangers that these two boys were falling into. Greed. So he tells a parable about a rich man who had a bumper crop, a great harvest. Of course, this is good news for any farmer. But the problem was, for the farmer, what do I do with all of this? Where do I store all this grain or whatever it was he had? So he says to himself, I know what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and my silos and whatever and build bigger ones so that I can store my crop. Then I can say to myself, you have so many good things stored up for years. Eat, drink, and be merry. But God had other plans and said to him, you fool, tonight your life will end. And then where will all of this stored up stuff go? The moral is we should not spend all of our time focusing on how to obtain riches in this life. Rather, we should be preparing ourselves to be rich in the ways of the kingdom. The rich man in the story is kind of the storybook example of greed. He should have asked himself, how much is enough? How much do I really need? It's one thing to be rich, but how much richer does a person have to become? The rich man viewed himself with pride. He even talks to himself in the third person. He compliments himself on his good crop. And he even says to himself, eat, drink, and be merry. Not once did he even entertain the idea of giving some of that crop away. This is the kind of pride or vanity, according to the first reading, which comes from identifying yourself with your material things. This kind of greed carries with it a heavy burden because our happiness becomes dependent on what we own. What is the remedy for greed? The Bible talks about this as much as it talks about the problem. Generosity. Generosity begins when we have a spirit of detachment from material things. We recognize that possessions are useful, but they are only a means to an end, not an end in and of themselves. I may have shared this story with you, I don't know, maybe some years ago. If you've heard it, I apologize. When I was pastor in Fresno, there was a parishioner who was in her late 70s. When you saw her, you would think that she was someone like pushing a shopping cart on the street. She was very small, very fragile, very wrinkled, weathered looking. She wore very simple clothing, usually the same thing every week. She wore very little makeup. She is long retired and spent most of her days volunteering in the church or at other charitable agencies. One day she invites me to dinner shortly after I had arrived there. So I went to her place not knowing what to expect, of course. And her apartment, little apartment, was scantily furnished. A couple of chairs, a sofa, a little TV that looked pretty ancient, and a table. And for dinner, this is what she brings out. Crackers, cold hot dogs, and cheese. So I'm thinking, okay. She gives me a glass of water. In our conversation, she starts telling me her history, that she grew up in the Depression in the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia. She said it was extremely poor. Her family was so poor that a priest invited them to live in the rectory with him. And in exchange for room and board, they took care of the rectory and cleaned house for him. Eventually, she was able, through the generosity of a relative, to get out of there and attend the university. She got a PhD in nutrition, and she worked for years as a hospital nutritionist, whatever they would call them. She told me, even though she had earned a nice living for herself, she never forgot the experience of what it was like living in poverty during her early years. And as a result, she refused to spend money on herself. She told me when she died, that I would be the one, if she died while I was there, that I'd be the one to distribute her money to certain charities. She had made provisions to give some funds to 2 nephews. She was never married, never had kids. So, she said, I was born poor and I will die poor. So I tried to be a little bit more playful. It was kind of a depressing conversation. I said, why don't you have some fun and go on a cruise? And she looked at me very seriously and she said, my fun will be when I get to heaven and it won't cost me a penny. That's what she told me. A year later, she was dying in the hospital. One leg had been amputated. She was near the end. And I anointed her and prayed with her and said my goodbyes. And she said to me, remember our conversation? And I said, yes. 2 weeks after we buried her, a woman makes an appointment with me. She sits down in my office and takes out some paperwork. She said, this is the estate of Patricia, which you are supposed to distribute. So I said, okay, give me the papers, thinking, I'm going to be dealing with some money here. She handed me the paperwork and I'm looking at it. Patricia was worth $800,000 in stocks and bonds. $800,000. All I could do was start laughing. This old lady had this kind of money. She never showed it. She never spent it on herself. She never flaunted it. No one knew. Everything was to be given to charity. And that's exactly what I did. I gave away $800,000 to dozens of charities in the Fresno area. And I have to tell you, it was a great feeling, just giving that money, which didn't belong to me, to other people. Now, that's an extreme example. God does not expect us to live in poverty. Poverty is not a good thing. We have a right to use our hard-earned money to provide for ourselves and our families. But over and above that, what is our responsibility? What God desires, that we have a healthy relationship with our wealth, with our possessions. That we understand our possessions are given to us not only for our well-being, but for the well-being of those who do not have anything. It's our obligation to be good stewards of what God has given us, of what God has allowed us to have. If we have that perspective, in doing so, we become rich in ways that matter to God. In turn, He will share eternal riches with us.